What if I told you that the smartphone in your pocket and the rocket reaching for Mars were actually invented 2,000 years ago? It sounds like a movie plot. It sounds impossible, but it is the truth. We usually think of the modern world as a Western creation. We think of the Industrial Revolution in England or Silicon Valley in California. We are taught that history moved from the Greeks to the Romans and then to Europe, but there is a massive hole in that story. While Europe was in the Dark Ages, one empire was already building the future. They were using biological weapons, flying multi-stage rockets, and printing thousands of books. They created the first robot and the first paper money. They even built a clock so advanced that Europe could not match it for centuries. We are not just talking about old stories. We are talking about the code for our daily lives. Every time you use a credit card, you are using a Chinese idea. Every time you use a GPS to find a store, you are using a Chinese discovery. In this documentary, we are going to strip away the chrome and the glass of the 21st century. We are going to go back to the dusty workshops of ancient China. We will show you how their 4 great inventions are the actual engines inside your Tesla and your laptop. You will see how an accidental explosion in a monk's kitchen led directly to the moon landing. If you stay with us until the very end, I have a special reward for you. I will reveal one lost invention that was so advanced the emperor had to hide it from the world. It is a piece of technology that we are only just starting to understand today. You do not want to miss it. Let's go back to where the modern world really began. Let's look at the Silicon Valley of the ancient world. The story of the modern rocket does not start at NASA. It starts in a quiet kitchen in China over 1,000 years ago. Imagine a group of monks. They are not soldiers. They are not scientists. They are alchemists. Their goal is simple. They want to live forever. They are mixing strange powders to find an elixir of life. They take some charcoal. They add sulfur. Then they mix in something called saltpeter. They heat it up, but instead of giving them eternal life, the mixture explodes. It burns their hands. It singes their beards. It blows the roof off the building. These monks had just accidentally invented gunpowder. At first, they were terrified. They thought it was a fire drug that was too dangerous to touch. But soon, the Chinese military saw a different potential. They realized this mistake could change the world of war forever. They began to experiment. They didn't just make bombs, they made fire arrows. They attached small tubes of gunpowder to the shafts of their arrows. When they lit the fuse, the arrow didn't just fly, it screamed through the air. This was the world's first rocket engine. By the 13th century, they were building things that looked like science fiction. They created a weapon called the fire dragon out of the water. This was a 2-stage rocket. One rocket motor would launch it across the water. Then, once it burned out, it would trigger a second set of rockets to shoot out of the dragon's mouth. This is the exact same technology we use to put satellites into space today. Think about that for a second. While the rest of the world was fighting with wooden shields and basic swords, China was using jet propulsion. They were calculating trajectory and thrust. They even used ground rats, which were small, spinning rockets that moved erratically to scare enemy horses. They turned a quest for peace and long life into the most powerful force on Earth. Every time you see a fireworks show or a SpaceX launch, you are seeing a 1,000-year-old Chinese mistake in action. They didn't just invent a weapon. They invented the way we leave the planet. Before we had the internet, we had paper. It sounds simple today. We throw it away every day. But before paper, ideas were heavy. If you lived in ancient China and you wanted to write a book, you had 2 choices. You could write on silk, which was so expensive only kings could afford it, or you could write on bamboo. Imagine a book made of hundreds of heavy wooden sticks tied together with string. One single book could weigh as much as a small dog. If a scholar wanted to move his library, he needed a team of oxen and a giant wagon. Knowledge was trapped. It was slow. It was for the rich. Then came a man named Kai Lun. He was an official in the Han Dynasty court. He watched people struggle with these heavy wooden boards. He saw that the world was moving too fast for bamboo. He decided to find a way to make light knowledge. He started experimenting in his workshop. He gathered old fishing nets. He found scraps of hemp. He stripped the bark from mulberry trees. He threw it all into a giant vat of water and mashed it into a pulp. He boiled it. He beat it with wooden mallets until it was a thin soup of fibers. Then he used a flat screen to lift the fibers out of the water. When it dried in the sun, it wasn't a heavy board or a piece of fabric. It was a smooth white sheet of paper. This was the first cloud storage. Suddenly, a person could carry 100 books in one hand. This changed everything for the government. They could send orders across the empire in days instead of weeks. They could keep records of every citizen, but paper was only half the battle. You still had to write everything by hand. This was slow. If you wanted a copy of a book, a monk had to sit for months and copy every letter. Mistakes were made. Knowledge was still being bottlenecked. So the Chinese inventors took the next giant leap. They looked at the seals used by emperors, stamps made of jade or gold. They thought, what if we make a giant stamp for a whole page? They began carving entire pages of text into blocks of wood. They would flip the block over, ink it, and press paper onto it. They could make 1,000 copies in a single day. This was the birth of mass media, but they didn't stop there. A man named Bai Sheng thought even bigger. He didn't want to carve a whole new block for every page. He created movable type. He carved individual characters out of clay and baked them until they were hard. He could arrange them to say anything, print a book, and then move the letters around to print a different book. This happened hundreds of years before Gutenberg was even born in Europe. This technology created the world's first information age. Because books became cheap, more people learned to read. This led to the world's first civil service exams. In China, you didn't become a leader just because your father was a lord. You had to pass a test. You had to study. This created a government run by the smartest people, not just the richest. When you look at your computer screen today, you are looking at the digital version of Kai Lun's mulberry bark. When you use a keyboard, you are using the digital version of Bai Sheng's movable type. These men didn't just invent a surface to write on. They invented the ability to share ideas across the entire planet. They broke the chains of the heavy bamboo past and let human thought fly. Imagine you are a sailor 1,000 years ago. You are in the middle of the ocean. The waves are as tall as houses. The sky is covered in thick black clouds. You cannot see the sun. You cannot see the stars. In this moment, you are blind. In the ancient world, if you lost sight of the shore, you were likely going to die. Sailors stayed close to the coast because they had no way to know which way was north. If the wind pushed you too far out into the deep blue, you were a ghost. History's greatest explorers were held back by a simple problem. They didn't have a map for the empty space of the sea. But in the quiet workshops of the Han Dynasty, something strange was happening. It didn't start on a ship, it started on the ground, with fortune tellers. These men were obsessed with the feng shui of the earth. They believed the ground had invisible lines of energy. They went into the mountains and found a very special kind of rock called lodestone. This rock was black, heavy, and looked like any other stone. But it had a secret power. It was naturally magnetic. The Chinese noticed that if you shaped this stone into a spoon and placed it on a smooth bronze plate, it did something impossible. No matter how many times you spun it, the handle of the spoon always pointed south. They called it the South Pointer. At first, they didn't use it for travel. They used it to align their houses and their temples with the energy of the universe. They thought they were talking to the spirits of the earth. They didn't realize they were actually talking to the magnetic core of planet Earth itself. As the centuries passed, The engineers of the Tang and Song dynasties took this magic spoon and turned it into a high-tech tool. They realized that a heavy stone spoon was too clunky for a rocking ship. They needed something lighter. They discovered that if you rub an iron needle against a lodestone, the needle steals the magic. The needle becomes magnetic. They found that if you float this needle on a tiny piece of wood in a bowl of water, it stays perfectly level. Even if the ship is crashing through a storm, that tiny needle stays still. It points the way home. This was the birth of the mariner's compass. This invention changed the shape of the world overnight. Before the compass, trade was tiny. After the compass, the ocean became a highway. The Chinese began building the largest ships the world had ever seen. These were called junks. Some of them were so big they had gardens on the deck to grow fresh vegetables for the sailors. They had hundreds of rooms. They were like floating cities. Because they had the compass, they didn't have to hug the coast anymore. They cut straight across the Indian Ocean. They reached Africa. They reached the Middle East. They were the masters of the sea, while European sailors were still afraid of monsters just a few miles from the beach. But why does this matter to you today in 2026? Think about how you move through the world. When you open a map app on your phone, a blue arrow shows you exactly which way you are facing. That arrow is the digital great-grandchild of the lodestone spoon. Your phone uses a magnetometer, which is a tiny chip that senses the Earth's magnetic field just like the ancient needles did. Without this Chinese discovery, we would have no GPS. We would have no satellite navigation. Pilots wouldn't be able to fly through clouds. Ships would still be lost at sea. The compass did more than just show the way. It created the global economy. For the first time, different continents could talk to each other regularly. Silk, spices and ideas began to flow in a constant stream. This was the first version of the supply chain. When you order something online today and it arrives from across the ocean, you are using a system that started with a fortune teller's magnetic spoon. We also have to look at the dark side of this invention. When the compass eventually traveled along the Silk Road and reached Europe, it changed history in a violent way. It allowed European powers to launch the age of discovery. It led them to the Americas. It led to empires that covered the globe. The very tool that China invented to find harmony with the Earth was eventually used by others to conquer it. The engineering of the compass also led to deeper scientific questions. By watching the needle, Chinese scholars were the first to realize that true north and magnetic north are not the same thing. They noticed the needle tilted slightly. This is called magnetic declination. They were doing advanced physics while most of the world was still trying to figure out if the Earth was flat. They understood that the planet was a giant magnet. They were the first people to plug in to the planet's hidden grid. So the next time you look at a map or use a compass, remember the lodestone. Remember the monks and the sailors who sat in the dark, watching a tiny needle float in a bowl of water. They weren't just looking for a port. They were unlocking the map of the entire world. They were the ones who proved that humans don't have to be blind in the dark. We just have to know how to listen to the Earth. We are now entering the world of money, but not the kind of money you can touch or clink in your pocket. We are talking about the ghost of money. Imagine you are a merchant in the year 900. You have just sold a massive shipment of silk. In return, you receive thousands of heavy iron coins. They are so heavy that you need a mule just to carry your profit home. If you want to buy a house, you need a whole wagon train of metal. It is dangerous. It is slow, and if a thief sees your heavy wagon, you are a target. This was the big problem of the ancient world. Physical wealth was too heavy to move. But the Chinese had a realization that would change human history forever. They realized that money doesn't have to be a piece of metal. Money is just an idea. It is a promise. They started with something called flying money. It worked like a modern bank. A merchant would leave his heavy coins with a trusted person in one city. That person would give him a piece of paper with a special seal on it. The merchant could then travel hundreds of miles, show that paper to another person, and get his coins back. The money was flying across the country because it wasn't moving at all. Only the information was moving. By the time of the Song dynasty, the government took this idea even further. They created the Zhouzi. This was the world's first true paper currency. For the first time in history, a piece of paper which had no value on its own could buy a bag of rice or a suit of armor. Why? Because the emperor said so. This is what we call fiat currency. It is the exact same system we use today with the US dollar, the euro, and the yen. When you look at a $20 bill, you are looking at a piece of paper that only has value because everyone agrees it does. The Chinese were the first to understand this psychological trick. This led to a massive boom in the economy. Because money was light, it could move fast. Because it moved fast, people could trade more. The Song dynasty became the richest society on the planet. They had the first middle class. They had restaurants, theaters, and massive shopping malls. They were living a modern life, while Europe was still bartering with chickens and cows. They even invented the concept of inflation. They realized that if they printed too much paper, it became worthless. They learned the hard way how to balance an economy. But the Chinese didn't stop at paper. They were the first to create a check, and the first to use promissory notes. They even had credit. If a farmer needed seeds, the government would give him a paper loan to be paid back after the harvest. This sounds like a modern bank, right? That is because it is. We often think the stock market or Wall Street started in London or New York. But the DNA of those systems was written in the tea houses of Hangzhou and Kaifeng. Now let's look at your life today in 2026. Think about how you pay for things. You probably use a credit card, or maybe you use an app on your phone, like Apple Pay or PayPal. Sometimes you don't even see a physical bill. You just see numbers on a screen. This is the final step of the Chinese invention. They took money away from the physical world and moved it into the information world. They proved that trust is more powerful than gold. Without paper money, the modern world would collapse. You couldn't have international trade. You couldn't have global companies. You couldn't have the internet economy. Every time you tap your card at a store, you are participating in a system that was perfected by Chinese accountants 1,000 years ago. They were the first to realize that wealth isn't what you carry in your hand, it's what people believe you have. The transition from metal to paper was the biggest shift in human power. It allowed governments to fund massive projects like the Great Wall or giant fleets of ships. It allowed for credit, which is the fuel for every modern business. But it also required a huge amount of trust. To make paper money work, the Chinese had to invent high-tech printing to prevent counterfeiting. They used special inks, complicated patterns, and even bark from secret trees. If someone tried to copy the money, the penalty was death. They treated their code for money just as seriously as we treat the security of a bank today. So the next time you look at a banknote or check your bank balance on an app, remember the Song dynasty. Remember the merchants who were tired of carrying heavy iron and decided to trust a piece of paper instead. They didn't just invent a new currency, they invented the way the entire world works together. They turned value into an invisible force that can travel around the globe in a second. Now we move from the world of invisible money to the world of heavy metal and clicking gears. Most history books tell us that the Industrial Revolution started in 18th century England with the steam engine. They say that before that the world was just manual labor. But if you traveled back to the Song dynasty in China, around the year 1000, you would see something that looked like a futuristic factory. You would see giant furnaces taller than houses. You would see mechanical hammers powered by water. You would see an empire that was producing 125,000 tons of iron every year. To put that in perspective, Europe wouldn't reach those numbers for another 700 years. China wasn't just a farming society, it was the world's first industrial superpower. The Chinese were the masters of cast iron. In Europe, blacksmiths were still banging on red-hot metal with hammers, one piece at a time. It was slow and exhausting. But the Chinese invented the blast furnace. They used giant bellows, often powered by water wheels, to pump air into a fire until it was hot enough to melt iron into a liquid. They could then pour that liquid into molds to make thousands of identical tools, plowshares and weapons. This was mass production centuries before Henry Ford was born. They even figured out how to turn that iron into steel by controlling the amount of carbon in the fire. They were using chemistry and physics to build the skeleton of a modern nation. But their greatest mechanical achievement wasn't a sword or a plow. It was a clock. We think of a clock as a small thing on a wall. But in the year 1088, an engineer named Su Song built the cosmic engine. This was a mechanical tower over 30 feet tall. It didn't just tell the time. It tracked the stars, the moon, and the planets. It featured a giant bronze sphere on top that moved perfectly with the rotation of the Earth. Inside this tower was a complex system of wheels, gears, and chains. But there was a problem. How do you keep a giant machine moving at a perfectly steady speed? If it moves too fast or too slow, the time is wrong. To solve this, Su Song invented the escapement. This is a tiny mechanical part that escapes one tooth of a gear at a time, creating that tick-tock sound we know today. It is the heart of every mechanical watch ever made. He also used the world's first chain drive. If you look at the chain on your bicycle, or the timing chain in a car engine, you are looking at Su Song's DNA. His clock was a robot before the word robot existed. It had wooden figures that would jump out and ring bells or beat drums to announce the hour. It was a masterpiece of precision engineering. The Chinese were also the first to use the piston bellows. This is a device that creates a continuous blast of air. It uses a sliding piston inside a box. This might sound boring, but it is the exact same concept used in the internal combustion engine of your car. Without the piston, we have no engines. Without the engine, we have no planes, cars, or factories. The Chinese had all the Lego bricks of the Industrial Revolution sitting on their workbench. They had the high-grade steel, the coal power, the piston, and the gear systems. So why does this matter to you in 2026? Because we are currently in the middle of a robotics revolution. We are building AI-powered machines to do our work, but we are using the same mechanical principles, gears, chains, and pistons that were perfected in China a millennium ago. The cosmic engine proved that humans could build a machine that mimics the movements of the universe. It showed that we could automate time and labor. Even their transport was ahead of its time. Have you ever used a wheelbarrow to move dirt in your garden? That is a Chinese invention called the wooden ox. Before the wheelbarrow, you needed two people to carry a heavy load in a basket. The Chinese realized that by putting the wheel in the center, the machine carries the weight, and the human just provides the balance. This allowed one man to do the work of four. It allowed them to build massive canals and walls that still stand today. Ancient China was a world of clicking gears and roaring furnaces. They were the first to treat the world like a giant machine that could be measured, timed, and improved. When you see a giant robotic arm in a Tesla factory, or look at the gears inside a luxury watch, you aren't looking at new technology. You are looking at the evolution of Su Song's tower and the iron-clapping hammers of the Song dynasty. They laid the tracks and the rest of the world is just riding the train. We have covered the mechanical genius of China. Now we need to address the big mystery. It is called the Great Divergence. We have seen that China had everything. They had the gunpowder for weapons. They had the compass to find new lands. They had the printing press to spread ideas. They even had the factories and the steam engine technology to start an industrial revolution. By the year 1200, China was centuries ahead of the rest of the world combined. So, why are we speaking English today instead of Chinese? Why did the Industrial Revolution happen in a small, cold island like England instead of the massive, wealthy cities of China? To understand this, we have to look at how China viewed the world. In Europe, the continent was broken into dozens of small, warring countries. Because they were always fighting, they were always looking for a killer app. They wanted a faster ship or a better gun so they could beat their neighbor. But China was different. It was a unified empire. Most of the time it was one giant country under one emperor. Their goal wasn't to change the world, it was to keep things stable. They didn't want disruptive tech. They wanted harmony. The Chinese government was run by scholars, not businessmen. These scholars were brilliant, but they were also very conservative. They believed that the past was the perfect model for the future. They looked down on merchants and inventors. In their eyes, a person who made money by trading was less important than a person who studied ancient poetry. This scholar class eventually started to fear the very technology they had created. They saw that paper money could cause inflation if not controlled. They saw that big ships could bring in dangerous foreign ideas. So they did something that seems crazy to us today. They turned inward. In the 1400s, China had the treasure fleet. These were the largest wooden ships ever built. They were led by a famous explorer named Zheng He. He sailed all the way to Africa and brought back giraffes and gold. China could have easily discovered America or Europe. But when the fleet came back, the new emperor decided it was too expensive and too risky. He ordered the ships to be burned. He made it a crime to build a ship with more than 2 masts. China literally destroyed its own bridge to the rest of the world. They locked their doors and sat behind their Great Wall. While China was locking its doors, Europe was just waking up. Because Europe was messy and competitive, they borrowed the Chinese inventions and used them for conquest. They took Chinese gunpowder and made better cannons. They took the Chinese compass and used it to find the Americas. They took Chinese paper and printing and used it to start the Reformation and the scientific revolution. The West didn't invent the modern world, they just took the tools China had invented and used them to build an empire. This is the why factor. Technology alone isn't enough to change the world. You need a culture that wants to use it to disrupt the status quo. China used its genius to create a stable, peaceful society that lasted for thousands of years. Europe used that same genius to create a chaotic, fast-moving world of global trade and war. By the 1800s, the gap had finally closed, and Europe moved ahead. But today, in 2026, we are seeing the great convergence. China is no longer looking backward. They are once again becoming the world's laboratory for AI, green energy and space travel. The story of the Great Divergence is a warning for us today. It shows that no matter how advanced your technology is, it is the decisions of people that decide the future. A country can have the best computers and the fastest rockets, but if it stops being curious, it will fall behind. China didn't fail. They simply chose a different path, one of stability over expansion. But now, those two paths are meeting again. The Silicon Valley of the ancients has returned to the modern stage. This brings us to the end of our journey through the Silicon Valley of the ancients. We have seen how a monk's explosion became the fuel for the moon landing. We have seen how a lodestone spoon became the GPS in your phone. And we have seen how a simple mixture of tree bark and water allowed the entire world to share its thoughts. It is clear that we are not living in a world built by just the last few centuries. We are living in a world built on Chinese foundations. The modern world is much older than we were taught in school. As I promised at the beginning of this video, I have a reward for you. I want to reveal the lost invention that was so advanced the emperor kept it a secret. It is called the seismoscope, invented by a man named Zheng He in the year 132. Imagine a large bronze vessel, over 6 feet wide. Around the outside are 8 dragon heads, each facing a different direction. Each dragon holds a small bronze ball in its mouth. On the ground below them are 8 bronze frogs with their mouths open. For centuries, people thought this was just a piece of art. But it was actually the world's first earthquake detector. Inside the vessel was a delicate pendulum system. When an earthquake happened, even one hundreds of miles away that humans couldn't feel, the vibration would cause the pendulum to swing. It would hit a trigger, and the dragon facing the direction of the quake would drop its ball into the frog's mouth. Clang! The emperor knew exactly where to send help before the news even reached the palace. Modern scientists tried to rebuild it for years and failed. They couldn't understand how it was so sensitive without electricity. It was a piece of high-tech analog sensing that we are only just beginning to appreciate today. This invention represents the true spirit of ancient China. It was about listening to the earth. It was about using the laws of nature to protect people. Today, we often think of technology as something that separates us from nature, like concrete cities and plastic gadgets. But the Chinese inventors saw technology as a way to connect with the world. They watched the wind, the water, the stars, and the magnets to find a better way to live. As we move deeper into the 21st century, we are seeing a full circle. We are moving away from dirty factories and back toward the natural logic of the ancients. We are using the sun for power. We are using the Earth's magnetic fields for data. We are returning to the ideas that were born in those dusty workshops thousands of years ago. We are not just moving toward the future, we are reclaiming a very old and very brilliant past. Thank you for staying with me through this epic story. If you learned something new today, hit the like button and subscribe. It helps us keep telling these hidden stories of history. Now I have a question for you. Of all the inventions we talked about, gunpowder, the compass, paper, or the mechanical clock, which one do you think changed your personal life the most? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. Until next time, keep looking closer at the world around you. You never know what ancient secrets are hidden in plain sight.